the greatest fighters in MMA history. This is the definitive list, and any other list is completely wrong. If you disagree, you're absolutely wrong. No, I'm just kidding. But I do think this list is actually pretty good. For all of MMA, not just any single organization. For any all-time great list, you have to have some kind of criteria you're going by, right? Or it's just going to be all messy and disorganized. So what I'm going off on is, number one is the competition that the fighter beat. This is ultimately the most important thing that makes up everything else, from longevity to title wins, title defenses, how great the performances and stuff were. If you're not beating high-level fighters, all of that stuff can be very much inflated. But if a fighter has a longevity, great performances, a lot of title defenses and stuff, while also beating top-level competition, that is going to be extremely important and raise them very high in the all-time great list. And then all the other stuff is going to be there too, like title defenses, title wins, longevity, performances. This is ultimately what I'm going to go by. I think that does cover everything that you need to look at of someone's legacy. And yes, I'm going to include PED users. I usually don't, but it seems like everybody does it, so whatever. I'll include the PED users as well. Now, the number 10 spot, the number 10 greatest fighter of all time. 9 and 10 actually go hand in hand because it's a debate as to who's the greatest heavyweight of all time. And I would have to say the fighter that falls into the number 10 spot and the second greatest heavyweight of all time is Stipe Miocic. Stipe has the most title defenses in heavyweight history with a total of 4. He has 3 consecutively, and for the heavyweight division has beaten some of the greatest competition that division has ever seen, but not the best. I would probably say second best level of competition ever. When you look at guys like Fabricio Verdum, Junior Dos Santos, Alistair Overeem, Daniel Cormier twice, Francis Ngannou, that's a pretty strong list, man. But the reason why he's not above the number 9 guy is because most of his best wins were fighters that are already out of their primes. When he beat JDS was past his prime. And in fact, when they fought the first time, JDS beat Stipe Miocic. When Stipe beat Alistair Overeem, Overeem was also past his prime, and Overeem almost beat this guy in that fight. He dropped him and went in for the guillotine before Stipe came back and knocked him out. When he fought Francis Ngannou, he fought him before his prime, and then they rematched, and Ngannou knocked him out, dominated him very easily. So there leaves an argument as to if he fought Overeem and JDS in their primes, he arguably would have lost those fights. And even the Daniel Cormier fights, that is arguably a Daniel Cormier who is also past his prime as well. This is the big thing as to what puts Stipe below the number 9 guy and not as the greatest heavyweight of all time. But he did beat Fabricio Verdum, who was in his prime, coming off a big win against Cain Velasquez. He was the heavyweight champion, and the Daniel Cormier wins are absolutely high level regardless. Avenging his loss to DC, beating him twice, and also had that great adjustment in the second fight that you don't normally see from other heavyweights, right? Stipe has excellent skills, great boxer, good wrestling, and pretty high fight IQ for a heavyweight. Then we go to the number 9 greatest fighter of all time and the greatest heavyweight of all time, Fedor Emelianenko. Fedor has tied with Stipe the most consecutive title defenses in heavyweight history with 3. He went on a near 10-year unbeaten streak, which is among the longest in the sport's history across all organizations and weight classes. He was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world for many years, and unlike Stipe, his best wins were all fighters in their prime. When you talk about Mirko Cro Cop, when you talk about Big Nog on multiple occasions, Kevin Randleman, Mark Coleman, Tim Silva, Andrei Arlovski. Well, there is an argument that Tim Silva was not in his prime, but he was doing pretty well before he fought Fedor, right? It wasn't too far removed from when he lost to Randy Couture, losing his heavyweight title. It was only 3 fights after that. And Andrei Arlovski was on a 5-fight win streak, almost all knockouts, even KOing Roy Nelson and Ben Rothwell, defeating Fabricio Verdum before he fought Fedor, right? That was absolutely Andre at his best. And Fedor has also defeated the most UFC heavyweight champions in history. There's not a single heavyweight that beat more heavyweight champions than Fedor did. This is why I would have to put Fedor as the greatest heavyweight of all time and the number 9 greatest fighter of all time across all weight classes. The main reason he's not higher up on the list is because when you look at title wins and stuff like that and how regularly they were fighting top echelon fighters, Fedor wasn't doing that as much as some of the other fighters on this list. He had a lot of freak show fights and going up against guys that didn't really belong in there with him, and the losses in Strikeforce really hurt Fedor, at least the perception about him. But what Fedor has done throughout his career absolutely deserves to be in the top 10. And I would have to say the number 8 spot is a fighter who has way way more title defenses. Maybe the level of competition isn't as strong as Fedor's, or it's roughly around a similar level, and that is Anderson Silva. I have Anderson Silva as a number 8 greatest fighter of all time, and I know a lot of people are going to be very confused on that because a lot of fans and even fighters include Anderson in the top 5. Well, I can't include him in the top 5 for various different reasons. He is my favorite fighter ever. He's the fighter that made me a fan of the sport way back in 2011. But being completely objective, no bias at all, I cannot have Anderson in the top 5. Those guys in the top 5 I think are just better than he is, or greater than he is. But what does Anderson have that puts him in the top 10 at least? He has the performances. He has the championship records and the longest win streak in UFC history. 10 consecutive title defenses, which is the second most in MMA history. He has 11 title wins, a 16-fight win streak, which is the longest in UFC history, and spectacular performances across 2 different weight classes. There was nothing like an Anderson Silva title reign. We have never seen anything like it before. Those are the reasons why Anderson has to at least be in the top 10, and I argue top 8. The reason why he's not higher is because the level of competition he went up against honestly was not as strong as the other fighters above him. His greatest wins in his career were against Dan Henderson, Vitor Belfort, and Rich Franklin. You might count Forrest Griffin, maybe. He was a former champion. He was a division above Anderson, and Anderson absolutely destroyed him. First round knockout. And even those great wins that he has, they don't rival the fighters above him. Not only that, in his prime, he nearly lost to Chael Sonnen, and he's lost to a lot of fighters too as well. If he was facing higher level competition, we probably do not see that same title reign. But he fought who was there. That was the thing though. Anderson fought the best fighters of his era. It's just that his era wasn't necessarily that strong, in the middleweight division specifically. But whose era was very strong for their weight class was the number 7 greatest fighter of all time, and that is Max Holloway. Max Holloway, in my opinion, is the 3rd greatest featherweight of all time. He had 3 title defenses and 5 title wins in the featherweight division. Now those championship numbers look rather low, but the level of competition this guy beat on his way up to the title was extraordinary. This guy was like cleaning out the division before he ever got the belt. He went on a 10 win streak before fighting Jose Aldo for the undisputed title. 10 wins in a row. He got the interim championship against Anthony Pettis. He beat Ricardo Lamas, Jeremy Stevens, Cub Swanson, before he beat Jose Aldo in his prime by a 3rd round TKO. He rematched Jose Aldo. Not the same version because Aldo was preparing himself for another fight. Frankie Edgar was supposed to be the guy that fought Max Holloway. Aldo stepped in, got destroyed again by a 3rd round TKO. Then he went on to perform very well against Brian Ortega. He eventually beat Frankie Edgar, beat Calvin Kattar in one of the greatest performances we've ever seen, beat Yair Rodriguez, Arnold Allen, Korean Zombie, although Korean Zombie was definitely post-prime. And his greatest win, arguably, in his entire career against Justin Gaethje. He went up to a higher weight class against one of the scariest fighters there, a guy who was supposed to beat him and knock him out, maybe the first fighter to knock on Max Holloway. That was a narrative going into the fight. Holloway's just going to be completely outgunned by Gaethje, and he not only dominates Gaethje, but knocks him out in the 5th round, flatline KO, in one of the craziest sequences we've ever seen at UFC 300. The competition that he beat eclipses Anderson Silva's and Fedor's and Stipe's. Not even close. The Jose Aldo wins, just those 2, are greater than any single win from Fedor, Stipe, or Anderson's entire careers. Beating someone like Jose Aldo is just another level. And then add in Frankie Edgar, you add in Justin Gaethje, you add in even Anthony Pettis, even though he went down to a lower weight class, maybe not the same fighter. The biggest blunders of Max Holloway's legacy are the losses to Alexander Volkanovski. That's it. Those are like the only blunders, outside of losing to Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and Dennis Bermudez way early in his career when he was very young. But when he was in his prime, he lost to Volk 3 times. That is the biggest thing that goes against Holloway's legacy. If Volk never existed, Holloway could possibly be a top 5 GOAT. Not only that, Max Holloway is one of the best kickboxers we've seen in the sport. You know, some of the best kickboxing skills, very good boxing, developed to be a lot more well-rounded. And even though historically he's always had lower punching power, he found a way to make it work with supreme technique in the stand-up, and eventually sat down on his punches a lot more, where he was able to deliver with knockouts against Korean Zombie and Justin Gaethje, arguably making him an even better fighter than he's ever been before. So that is why I have to have Max Holloway in the number 7 spot on the all-time great list. In the number 6 spot is someone who is quite familiar with Max Holloway, someone who's had history with him, the 2nd greatest featherweight of all time, and that is Alexander Volkanovski. Where Holloway had 3 title defenses, Volkanovski had 5. 2 of those are against Max. He has 6 title wins and defeated fighters like Chad Mendes, Jose Aldo, Max Holloway 3 times, Brian Ortega, Korean Zombie, a bit past his prime, Yair Rodriguez, and nearly defeated Islam Makhachev the first time they fought each other in the division above. His competition that he beat is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, the Max Holloway wins alone, especially the third one, is one of the best wins you can have in the sport. And the way he dominated him was insane to see. The first fight was an obvious win for Volk, although it was kind of competitive. The second fight, he nearly lost. He had to resort to wrestling in order to turn the tides of that fight. Then in the third one, Volk showed everybody that he hit a new level. He outstruck Max Holloway, outboxed him, was faster than him, hit harder than him, higher fight IQ. That third performance against Max Holloway showed everybody as to why Volkanovski is one of the greatest fighters we've ever seen. Now, we do have to say that even though Yair, Ortega, and Holloway were all in their prime, Korean Zombie wasn't. Jose Aldo and Chad Mendes weren't either, right? Aldo and Mendes were a bit post-prime. Volk was pre-prime, right? He didn't hit his prime yet. But those are still very good wins for Volkanovski. I mean, Aldo and Mendes were still high level when they fought him. I mean, Mendes dropped Volk in their fight, gave him an absolute war. In the fight against Aldo, Volk just outskilled him and outsmarted him. Now, the biggest thing going against Alexander Volkanovski and being in the top 5 is that the Max Holloway wins really carry his legacy, right? Beating the same guy 3 times and also getting knocked out twice in a row against Islam and Topuria the way he did. It's hard to put him into the top 5 with those 2 things as part of his legacy. You know, going 1-3 in his last 4 fights, even though he did step up in short notice and he went up against a lightweight champion twice. It's hard to look at those kind of losses and be like, all right, he's definitely in the top 5, you know? He doesn't have like a long list of different kind of great wins that he has outside the Max Holloway wins. And that differs between him and the number 5 guy, right? The number 5 guy did not lose like that, and he has many other great fighters he beat instead of just one. When we talk about Volkanovski's skills, though, excellent kickboxer, one of the greatest strikers we've seen in the sport, very well-rounded, extremely high fight IQ, close to a perfectly skilled fighter. He just didn't have a great chin, and sometimes he didn't do too well in close range. But that is why ultimately I would have to have Alexander Volkanovski as the 6th greatest fighter of all time. And differing from him in the number 5 spot is Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib never lost in his entire career. He has multiple high-level wins against different fighters, and the most dominant fighter we've ever seen perform. He had 3 title defenses, the most in lightweight history, 4 title wins, also the most in lightweight history. He had a 13-fight win streak, only surpassed by Islam Makhachev with 14, and he has only lost 2 rounds in his entire career. Only 2 rounds. There has never been a fighter like that before. Not even close. The greatest fighters in the sport's history have lost more than 2 rounds. But Khabib is a very controversial all-time great fighter. A lot of people disagree with whatever place you put him at. People disagree if you put him in the top 15. People disagree if you put him in the top 3. He's a very hot and cold fighter due to his legacy. Now, it's true. Khabib, for the first 16 fights in his career, he didn't really beat anybody. And a lot of those fights were only 2 rounds. In fact, I think all of those fights may have been 2 rounds, which is borderline not a professional fight even. And I can see how people say that inflates his 29-0 record. But when he came into the UFC, he went undefeated as well, only lost 2 rounds, dominated almost everybody he fought outside of Gleison Tibau wasn't a domination. Everybody else absolutely got destroyed. Even Ally Quinta, which a lot of people say, oh, you know, it wasn't that dominant. He had a 50-43 scorecard against him, and that was very reasonable too. Ally Quinta didn't do anything except defend, and that's what a lot of people say about Khabib. If you just defend what he does, you know, it doesn't seem that dominant anymore. But people forget that he's still winning the fight completely. And on the other side, a lot of people seem to underrate the high-level wins he had at the later end of his career against Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, Conor McGregor, and Rafa dos Anjos. Those wins are insanely high level, especially Dustin, and RDA, all in their primes, by the way. All in their prime. Now, the only thing with the Conor McGregor win is that he probably was not in his best form with how long that layoff was after the Floyd Mayweather boxing match. It's very understandable to think that Conor wasn't at his very best fighting Khabib there, but still in very good form, still in his prime, or at least his physical prime. And I don't think any version of Conor McGregor in hindsight would have beat Khabib that night. Khabib has the greatest wins in lightweight history. To beat Justin, Dustin, Conor, and RDA and dominate all 4 of them, only losing 2 rounds in total out of those fights is absolutely insane. And that's not even to bring in Michael Johnson, who was in his prime as well, top 5 fighter. Not too long before that, knocked out Dustin Poirier in the first round. He also beat Edson Barboza, who was a good good fighter as well. Stylistically, a horrible matchup for Edson. This is why you have to have Khabib in the top 5 in my opinion, but I don't think you can have him in the top 4. The reason why I cannot have Khabib in the top 4 is because he ultimately just did not have longevity. He didn't stay on top that long. 3 title defenses, 4 title wins. He has like 4 great wins and maybe 6 total good wins throughout his career. It just does not meet the standard of the top 4 in my opinion. The top 4 is absolutely concrete. In the number 4 spot, I have to put Jose Aldo, the greatest featherweight of all time. 9 title defenses consecutively, which is the 3rd most in the history of the sport. 11 title wins, went on a 9-year unbeaten streak. His numbers are rivaling the absolute best fighters in the world. And to go with that is his competition that he beat. Prime Chad Mendes, prime Frankie Edgar twice, prime Uriah Faber, prime Mike Brown, snapping Mike Brown's 10-win streak, winning the WEC World Champion against him, and even beat fighters like Cub Swanson, knocking him out in 8 seconds with a double flying knee, Korean Zombie, Ricardo Lamas, Renato Moicano, Jeremy Stevens, even going down to the bantamweight division and beating Chito Vera, Pedro Munoz, Rob Font, and arguably should have won the fight against Marlon Moraes, who at the time was the scariest bantamweight in the world. He's got all the championship numbers and a strong list of competition he beat to include him in the top 4. Not only that, amazing Muay Thai skills, amazing boxing skills in general, the best anti-wrestler in the game, best takedown defense we've ever seen, well-rounded fighter. Skills-wise, the only thing that really went against him is the fact that he would gas out. He was so explosive, so fast twitch, that he would often gas out before the 5th round ever hit. Even against guys like Mark Hominick and Ricardo Lamas, he had a hard time in those 5th rounds against them. Guys that he should absolutely dominate the whole fight. And that's a big reason as to why he lost against Max Holloway in their first fight. He was winning the whole fight until he started to slow down, and then Max Holloway built his momentum and TKO'd Jose Aldo. He also did very well against Peter Yan for the first 2 rounds as well. So that is why I have to have Jose Aldo as the number 4 greatest fighter of all time. In the number 3 spot, this is where it gets quite debatable between number 3 and number 2. But I ultimately have to have number 3 as Demetrius Johnson. Demetrius Johnson is the greatest flyweight of all time. He has the most consecutive title defenses in the sport's history with 11. He has 12 title wins in the UFC if you count 1 championship. Then he has 14 title wins. And he got those 11 title defenses in the UFC within like 4 years. It was crazy. Not only that, the list of fighters he beat is extremely underrated. From Joseph Benavidez, twice, even knocked him out in the 2nd fight. Knocked out Henry Cejudo in the 1st round. Defeated Ali Bagotinov, who was on EPO, a performance-enhancing drug that was supposed to help his cardio, right? Help him carry a very fast pace for 5 rounds, and DJ outpaced him naturally. He also got a last-second submission win against Kyoji Horiguchi. He was one of the best fighters he ever fought against. 1 second left of a 25-minute fight. Submitted him with an armbar. He also has the greatest submission win in the sport's history with that flying crazy armbar against Ray Borg. He also submitted Wilson Hayes, high-level black belt. He beat John Dodson twice in his prime and avenged his loss to Adriano Moraes in the bantamweight division, or at 135, in one championship they call it flyweight. 135 pounds, he beat Adriano Moraes twice in a row after losing to him. And the loss to Henry Cejudo was very controversial. A lot of people thought Henry won, a lot of people thought DJ won. It was a very competitive fight. So that is why I have to have Demetrius Johnson in the number 3 spot of the all-time great list. Now the thing that differs between the number 3 and the number 2 guy is that Demetrius didn't beat every single fighter he ever lost to, right? He tried his hand in bantamweight and he wasn't able to beat Dominic Cruz. He also lost to Brad Pickett way back in the day. With the 2nd greatest fighter of all time, he beat every single fighter he ever fought. Georges St Pierre, the greatest welterweight ever, 9 title defenses, which is tied with Jose Aldo, 13 title wins, which is for both welterweight and middleweight. He's a 2-time welterweight champion, a 2-weight world champion, both middleweight and welterweight. He's just a champion, dude. That's just what he is. Georges St Pierre is all about gold, all about the title wins. He went on a 13-fight win streak and defeated some high-level competition. Carl Parisian, Sean Shirk, BJ Penn twice, Matt Hughes twice, Josh Koscheck twice, John Fitch, Jake Shields, one of his best wins, Carlos Condon, Nick Diaz, controversially against Johnny Hendricks, and he beat Michael Bisping. He's one of the only fighters ever to beat 3 generations of fighters, which is arguably the hardest achievement any champion can ever get. But what goes against Georges St Pierre's legacy? Well, he should never have lost to Matt Serra. That's the biggest one. He was given that controversial win against Johnny Hendricks, and he wasn't really finishing opponents after he avenged the Matt Serra fight. There was a lot of decision wins after that, showing that he wasn't as exciting as maybe Jon Jones was, or Anderson Silva, or Demetrius Johnson, but his style was a bit different, right? He was fighting the path of least resistance against his opponents, showing very high fight IQ, and also being an extremely well-rounded fighter, developing one of the best wrestling games we've ever seen in MMA. A guy who started as a karate fighter somehow happened to be one of the best wrestlers in the sport. And that is ultimately why I would have to have Georges St Pierre as the second greatest fighter of all time. He had a bunch of championship wins, strong list of competition, beat every single fighter he ever faced. He has longevity, two-weight world champion, and he was very dominant for most of his title reign. And then we go to the greatest fighter of all time. Of course, it's Jon Jones. He is the greatest fighter to walk the planet. There's not a single fighter in any sport that's better than Jon Jones. Imagine being the man who can walk on earth and say that no one can beat you in a fight. On paper, that's essentially what he is. Even though we could see Francis Ngannou beat him or Tom Aspinall, there are certain matchups that are very interesting for Jon Jones to see who is the better fighter. But right now, it's Jon Jones. 15 title wins, the most of any fighter in history, even more than Georges St Pierre's. 8 title defenses, which is the most in light heavyweight history. He has a total of 11 if you include the title defenses after he got his belt vacated. That's just not consecutive, you know. He's a two-weight world champion, defeated Cyril Gane for the heavyweight title, and the level of competition he beat is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, probably among any fighter that's ever fought in the sport. I mean, this guy beat Daniel Cormier twice, kind of. The second one's a no contest because of the whole Turinabol metabolite thing. He beat Alexander Gustafsson twice. He beat Ryan Bader, Shogun, Rampage, Lyoto, Rashad, Vitor, Glover, kind of Thiago Santos and Dominic Reyes, and then Cyril Gane. He beat a total of 8 champions, which I think is the most in the sport, and he beat every single fighter he ever fought besides Matt Hamill. Man, Matt Hamill still got that win over him. No, I'm just kidding. That DQ loss really doesn't mean anything. 12-6 elbows. Jon Jones was destroying Matt Hamill. Nobody really looks at that loss as a real loss for Jon Jones. He really is kind of undefeated, except if you do count the Dominic Reyes controversial unanimous decision, and that is ultimately why Jon Jones is the greatest fighter of all time. He also has extremely good technique, very high skill, the highest fight IQ ever, well-rounded, beats most of his opponents in their own game, which is absolutely insane. And that submission win against Lyoto Machida is still one of the scariest wins ever in a fight. And that is ultimately the top 10 greatest fighters of all time. I would say honorable mentions are Israel Adesanya, Kamaru Usman, Dominic Cruz, Daniel Cormier, and Henry Cejudo. If there was a top 15 list, then you would see those 5 fighters also included with the greatest fighters of all time, right? That's your top 15. Not in that order. I probably have like maybe Daniel Cormier number 11, Henry Cejudo number 12, maybe Adesanya 13, then Usman 14, Dominic Cruz 15, maybe. But I think this top 10 is pretty good. And if you disagree or if you agree, leave in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe and I'll see you guys in the next video.